Hi, I'm Talia Adler, and today I'll be looking at two of London's most infamous World War I memorials, the Cenotaph and the Royal Artillery Memorial, to comparatively analyze the differences in their architecture styles and their representations of the war. In addition, I'll be looking at the World War I exhibit at the Imperial War Museum and analyze how the artifacts commemorate the Great War. The Cenotaph, pictured here, resides in Whitehall, Westminster in London. Designed by Edwin Lutyens in 1919, the Cenotaph was created to commemorate all fallen soldiers of the Great War. With its simplistic design, Andrew Whitmarsh would say it appears to offer a sanitized version of commemoration because it does not have any particularly war-specific components, even going so far as to not even inscribing names into it. Its simplicity is not just in its architecture, but its symbolism as well. Lutyens designed the memorial to be secular, however, it suffered much scrutiny, for some people felt that it's too pagan Christian-oriented with the wreath, perhaps because of the massive movement to Christianity during the war years. The memorial does point to the soldiers, but again in a very sanitized way. George Moss's idea of the myth of war experience, described as the romanticized idea that civilians have about the war, is exemplified here by referring to all of the dead as glorious. Lutyens obliviously contributes to the myth himself by referring to all of the dead as glorious, and sanitizes the gruesome and maybe some unhonorable deaths that happened during World War I. On the contrary, the Royal Artillery Memorial in the corner of Hyde Park in Kensington, designed by Charles Sargent Jagger and Lionel Pearson, gives a more realistic representation of what went on during the war in terms of the soldiers. The memorial, built in 1920, has 3 living and 1 fallen soldier surrounding a cannon. The soldiers shown here have a very stoic look on their faces, which represents the somber atmosphere of a soldier's life in battle. This soldier is shown holding several coats that presumably symbolize the mass amount of death that took place during the Great War. In George Moss's book, The Fallen, he discusses that everyone, including the soldiers, were taken aback by the mass amount of death that happened during the war because no one alive during the time of the Great War had gone through a war before. Perhaps the stoicism in their face also represents that the soldiers were trying to hide how unprepared and maybe scared they were during the war. Martin Garretson's dissertation on the memoirs and diaries of Canadian soldiers during the Great War unveils that some soldiers contributed to the myth to protect their families and loved ones from the horrors of war. The soldier pictured here seems to be recently deceased and covers by his fellow soldiers who, by doing this, are contributing to the myth themselves. Jagger could have shown a vulgarly wounded soldier, but chose to cover him, furthering the contribution to the myth. But it definitely makes the memorial easier for suffering families to turn to. Although the Royal Artillery Memorial contributes to the myth, it does not do so as deliberately as the Cenotaph. The Royal Artillery Memorial attempts to portray some realistic properties of the war, whereas the Cenotaph just avoids any realistic depiction of the war at all. Although the Cenotaph is a classic example of Moss's myth, it is nicer for families and loved ones to look to for remembrance rather than a battered soldier, like in the Royal Artillery Memorial. The uniform pictured here in the World War I exhibit at the Imperial War Museum is very sanitized and contributes to the myth of war experience that Moss describes. The uniform is in pristine condition with flowers in the breast pocket to make it look beautiful and unwounded. Civilians are not shown the bloody, beaten, and battered uniforms of the soldiers that were fighting in the trenches, and it allows them to not be able to visually understand the toll that the war took on the soldiers. The only artifact I could really find in the exhibit was a piece of shattered window of a fighter plane pictured here. The small broken piece of window makes me feel much more shaken up about what went on in battle than a uniform kept in mint condition. The glass shows how rough and dangerous the war was. The uniform is nice to see, but this glass shatters the myth to pieces, no pun intended, because it's real and it's scary. During my research, I learned a lot. I went from hating the war and not even knowing what the myth of war experience was, let alone coming to the realization that I was subject to the myth as well. Going out to the memorials and museums after my research gave me a bigger appreciation for war because I understand that the memorials are put in place for people to cope. Whether people are subject to the myth or not, people use the memorials and museums to remember the war, and going to see them gave me a deeper appreciation of what remembrance really is and why so many people appreciate these memorials and museums so much.